right, welcome. Good morning. Welcome to everyone in the room here. Thanks for coming. And welcome to the first ever Fox Motors YouTube live event. There's some debate whether this is the first ever. So we've done a streaming event before, but it was on Teams. But I'm calling this one the first ever YouTube live event. So we're very excited to try this new format, and thank you to everyone here who's live in our live studio here, and welcome to everyone else, all 2,500 employees, team members who are streaming live, hopefully at over our 45 plus locations. So we do have a good audience here. And for those who are watching remotely, we are coming to you live from the world-renowned Delta by Marriott Hotel in Farmington Hills, Michigan. So welcome to everyone. Well, my name is Mark Tomasic. I'm General Counsel here at Fox Motors. And for those of you who have been with us for a while, you know that July is Safety Month for Fox Motors. And really, we focus on safety here, and we devote an entire month to it because our highest priority here is the health and safety of all of our team members, our 2,500 plus team members. And the goal, of course, is for the work environment where you come in every single day to provide great service to our customers and to grow your careers, that you can do it in the healthiest, safest, and most productive manner possible. And in the last several years, really, this is, I think, our 8th year doing a safety month kind of in this format, we focused on more traditional safety type issues in the workplace, like eye and ear protection, or slip and falls, or proper lifting techniques. And those are, of course, very critical, and those are things that you encounter every single day. This year, though, however, we're going to talk about a different topic. It's maybe a little bit more of a difficult topic to kind of embrace, because it's something that we see and hear, unfortunately, in the news with some regularity. In fact, I was even hearing something this morning about an active shooter or a mass shooting. But what we're here to talk about today is the potential for violence in the workplace. And although this is very rare, it's very rare, and most of us will never encounter anything like this in our lives, it does happen, and we could. And Fox Motors, we could do everything in the world, but none of us are immune. And Fox Motors is not immune from something like this happening at one of our locations. So the goal here today is to get some takeaways so that if the unfortunate thing, God forbid, does happen at one of our locations, our customers, our team members, and everyone who's in our store that day would have the greatest possibility and the greatest likelihood of coming out of that event safely. So who we've brought in today to help lead this discussion is Jason Russell. And Jason is someone who's worked with us before, and he's really very much the foremost expert in this field. So let me just tell you a little bit about him briefly. He's the CEO of a company called Secure Education Consultants. He's a graduate of Western Michigan University with a degree in criminal justice, and he has a master's from Michigan State University in security management. He's a former Lansing police officer. He's a former Secret Service agent, and he was recently appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to Michigan's School Safety and Mental Health Commission. Welcome to those just coming in here to the room. We do have a real live audience for those who are streaming. Believe it or not, there are people here in this room. But overall, Jason's just a really interesting guy, and I think you're going to really find this hour here discussing this topic to be very worthwhile. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who took some time away on a Monday morning. As Mark mentioned, we're going to talk about workplace violence, but we're going to break it into really two different pieces. We're going to talk at the first half about kind of prevention. So what are some things we can do to prevent an incident from ever happening in the first place? And then the second half, we're going to talk more about, hey, if we aren't able to prevent it, how do we respond to one of these types of situations? As was pointed out, still a very rare occurrence, right? The reality is, you're probably not likely to face an active shooter situation in your personal life or in your work life. However, it's possible. And I think we prepare for things that aren't necessarily guaranteed. We prepare for things that are possible as well. And this becoming such a prevalent issue across the country is something that most organizations are at least having discussions about and starting to prepare for. But part of what we're going to do today, especially in the response side, is talk about elements that actually relate to multiple emergencies. So not just an active shooter situation, but some of these things would relate to any type of an emergency that you were facing. So physiology, decision-making processes that really could come into play no matter what the emergency was. So the value, I think, of training like this is not only for what you're doing at work, and especially as we talk about some of the things you might see that would allow you to prevent a workplace violence incident, that certainly is valuable, but also in your personal life, should you find yourself out with your family at a concert, wherever you were at, and you were faced with an emergency situation, just some tips and techniques and ways that you can improve your ability to respond, I think, is super important. And the reality is, what we see, especially in emergency response, is speed is everything, right? And we're going to talk about kind of the importance of understanding, picking up on the fact that a dangerous situation is happening so that you can begin to start responding. So before we do that, though, I want to talk a little bit about targeted violence. So when we think about workplace violence, I mean, that's kind of a term that gets thrown out there quite a bit, robbery type situation. This is violence that happens as a result of another criminal act, right? So I've come into a bank, I'm going to rob that bank, and then whatever happens in this planned robbery, and I ended up committing some type of violence on those people. Customer client is somebody that is buying from you, somebody that is coming to one of your locations, is committing some type of a violent act. They're upset about something that happened. They're angry because you didn't give them the deal they wanted, or the service didn't come out the way they wanted, or whatever it might be. Employee coworker is somebody that you work with, right? So that's somebody that works within the organization that is committing violence within that organization. And then external connection is what we call domestic spillover. That's basically somebody connected to somebody that works in your organization. So a stalker, ex-boyfriend, domestic situation. That's the most common origins of targeted violence in the workplace, right? So it's somebody that works there, it's somebody connected to somebody that works there, it's somebody who's upset with an organization because of something they believe they've done, or it's a robbery type situation and the violence occurs as part of that. Now really what you do, the type of business that you're in, really dictates where your most likely origin is. The one thing about the business you all are in is it's a little bit unique in that most organizations have one area of risk that is far higher than others. In other words, manufacturing would be an example, right? When you think about manufacturing facilities, they don't have a huge risk in the customer-client arena because they don't have customers coming in, right? Manufacturing doesn't have a huge risk in the robbery, the criminal intent one, because they don't have people coming in. There's nothing of value, right? So their risk tends to be in the employee coworker and the external connection, the domestic spillover. But the business you all are in actually is unique in that you have a risk in all four categories, which actually makes it the most difficult to try to secure with traditional security methods. Now, not only are there four origins, but there's actually also four motives. So why does somebody commit an act of violence? Now, this occurs, or this also applies to any other active shooting situation that you've ever heard of, that you've seen on the news or that you've read about, right? The motives are consistent across these events. And they fall into one of four categories. The most common motive for an active violence attack is to avenge some type of real or perceived grievance. In other words, you have done something to me, or I think you have done something to me. You have made me angry, therefore, I'm going to commit this violent act to avenge that particular real or perceived grievance. This is by far, especially in workplaces, the most common motive. It's a terminated employee. It's a customer who's upset about something, right? You've done something to me, or I think you've done something to me. The second most common motive is to achieve some type of fame and notoriety. Now, this generally is directed at very specific types of targets, right? So in other words, I'm going to get far more notoriety if I attack a school, or I attack a parade, or I attack a concert, and I have multiple victims, than if I attack a car dealership, right? Because it doesn't make as much sense. If I'm trying to get maximum number of victims, a car dealership is not the most obvious choice for that, right? So usually the motive for an attack that would happen in one of the places you all would be in that first category, right? It's to avenge some real or perceived grievance, okay? The third one would bring national attention to a perceived problem. Once again, not common in other than religious organizations, something that represents something, right? So churches are a big target for this, right? Or an attack that occurs at a specific type of an event. If I was trying to bring national attention to a perceived problem, I might attack a specific type of event because of what that event represented, or I might attack a specific type of organization because of the type of work that they did. And then the fourth one would be radicalization, which is basically terrorism, right? Now, the thing about workplace violence, things that occur internally are often preceded by warning signs. We call these behaviors of concern, okay? And actually, every targeted violence attack you've ever heard of, no matter where it was preceded by some observable warning signs. Now, whether anybody observed those warning signs or not, obviously is up to question, but they were there. So one of the things that we're trying to train more and more people on is here are the behaviors that are common prior to somebody launching some type of a targeted violence attack. If you see these behaviors, doesn't mean that somebody's necessarily going to commit an attack, but these are the behaviors that are consistent with people that do. And you can look at any event and you can track back and say these are the particular types of behaviors that we saw in this person. And you've probably heard these on the news. You've definitely heard them on the news when they're discussing an event. They start to talk about the behaviors that that person exhibited prior to launching this attack, right? You hear about, oh, well, they had a bunch of guns and they hated the government, or they were being bullied, or whatever it might be, right? You start to hear about these individual behaviors. The reality is many of these behaviors are observable prior to the event. In fact, this kind of prevention of targeted violence as a discipline or as a science is actually pretty new, but more and more organizations are actually paying attention to this and doing something about it. This is where your workplace violence policies come from, right? Is we're trying to say, hey, if we know what these behaviors are, we should probably be looking for them, and if we see them, we should probably do something about it, right? So that's really what most workplace violence policies are designed around, is identifying and reporting these behaviors of concern. And at the end of this, Mark will talk a little bit about making sure you all understand how that would work within DP Fox. So once again, these are the behaviors that we see in people commonly. Usually we don't find out about some of these behaviors until after the attack. In other words, people say, oh yeah, he was doing this or they were doing that, and we kind of put all those pieces together afterwards. The goal of a good workplace violence policy would be to hopefully identify those behaviors and start to put those pieces together ahead of time. These people often have difficulty getting along with others, so they have consistent interpersonal conflicts with coworkers, with even people, their neighbors. Like, they're just somebody that has consistent and repeated interpersonal issues. Sometimes they make direct threats. This is an obvious one, but still one that is often ignored. I've dealt with organizations where this has actually been the case. Somebody said, I'm going to do this, and they kind of ignored it. That's no longer something that we can do. So oftentimes these people will make direct threats. They'll say things like, I'm going to kill somebody, or I'm going to shoot, this place is going to be sorry, I'm going to come and shoot this place up, or whatever it is. Those are things that should be taken very seriously. Oftentimes these people fail to take responsibility for their own, any failings that they might have. So they often, anything that goes bad in their life, they'll blame it on other people. They'll blame it on, these people are out to get me, or whatever. They never take responsibility for their own actions. Combat conditioning is a concept that we talk about when it comes to desensitization to violence. So I'm going to spend just a couple seconds on this because it's a very complex concept, but we are seeing more and more evidence that most people that commit some type of an active violence attack have some history of being combat conditioned. And what combat conditioning is essentially the erosion of the natural apprehension that a human being has to violence with another person, right? So most people, normal people, I'm assuming, I don't know that for sure, but I'm just going to hope that you're all normal. Right. Most people have a natural apprehension to be violent without provocation with another person. That's the reason most people don't go around and kill people randomly, right? Because you have this kind of invisible barrier in your brain that says, hey, unless you're protecting yourself, you really shouldn't hurt another person. Now, a small percentage of people don't have that barrier. We call those people sociopaths or psychopaths. That's where your serial killers come from, right? They hurt people and they don't, and there are people that aren't necessarily serial killers, but don't really have that aversion to violence. Now, the problem with that is actually there is some practical needs for human beings to be violent with other human beings. And actually, there's some areas in society where we actually need human beings to be violent with other human beings, but we need it to be under the right conditions. So I was combat conditioned. When I was a police officer and a Secret Service agent, when they were training me, they were essentially training me that under the right set of circumstances, it is okay to be violent with another person. And the way they did that was by training me using techniques that reduced my apprehension to be violent with another person. And one of those ways is by literally making the targets that I shot at look like a person. So psychologically, what that's doing is saying, hey, under the right set of circumstances, it is actually okay to be violent with another human being. Now, what we're seeing actually, though, in civilians, in people that are non-military, non-police, is actually more and more combat conditioning than ever before, and it's happening in other ways. It's happening actually through video games and through media. So if you've ever played any of these first-person shooter games, Call of Duty, whatever, that's a form of combat conditioning. It's actually reducing your apprehension to violence. It's actually literally physically combat conditioning you because you're understanding target, all those other things. So that's one of the things we see is these people often have those types of things in their background. Now, one of the things that I will say about these behaviors is no one individual behavior in and of itself necessarily means the person is going to be violent. In other words, we generally see these things in aggregate. All right. They're often experiencing some type of personal life stress. So they're going through divorce, they're having financial issues, like they're going through something in their life that's causing them stress. Maybe the loss of a job. That's why you often see people, especially in workplaces, they commit the violence right after they're terminated because we've created a grievance and we've probably increased their personal life stress because now they have financial issues. And they don't take responsibility for their actions, so they're blaming the fact that they got fired not on the fact that they were late for work every day and that they were terrible at their job, but that you just don't like them and you've created this grievance now, okay? They're often inflexible, which means they don't respond well to changes. They don't adapt well when there's changes in policies, procedures. Oftentimes we see they're obsessed or show interest in previous events. So, they'll talk about previous shootings. In school shootings, we see this a lot. Oftentimes we see paranoia as an issue, so everybody's out to get me. Depression or suicidal tendencies, easy to anger. They have access to weapons, so not only do they have this combat conditioning, but they actually have access to what they would need to actually carry out an attack. Sometimes we see evidence of radicalization, so they're showing sympathy or something to terrorist organizations. Gathering of weapons and ammo, increased target practicing, recent real or perceived loss. This once again goes back to, hey, something bad has happened, right? History of stalking or harassment. This is a big one in workplaces. I probably deal with, 3 to 5 calls a week from workplaces that are having some type of threat. And that stalking or harassment is one of the ones that is pretty common. I see almost 100% of the time in places that have a significant threat. In other words, we're getting ready to fire this person or we're terminating them, we're giving them discipline, we're concerned because they've shown warning signs before and they want to kind of know what to do with them. Changes in their grooming habits, so oftentimes they'll stop taking care of themselves. They're often loners or isolated, so they don't really participate with the group, they're just kind of off on their own. And sometimes we'll see what we call leakage or veiled threats. So it's not a direct threat, I'm going to shoot this place up, but it's, yeah, you may not want to show up to work tomorrow, something bad's going to happen, right? That would be an example of a leakage. I didn't say exactly what I'm going to do, but I made some statements that, if thought through, might be concerning. So once again, as you think about the prevention side, it really is focusing on behaviors. The idea behind a good workplace violence prevention program is we train people on these behaviors, so that's kind of why we're making this video and having these trainings, is give you a little bit of basic awareness of these. And then also have a mechanism by which we can report these behaviors, and Mark will talk about that real quick at the end here when we wrap up. So, all right, that's the prevention side. We didn't have a ton of time, so we're getting through that quick, right? Now the response side. What do we do if we actually have to respond to an emergency? Okay, human beings are actually designed physically and mentally. We're designed to respond to emergencies, but we're designed to respond to emergencies that don't happen anymore. We're designed to respond to very prehistoric emergencies that are very uncomplicated, right? So an animal is trying to kill me and I need to run, right? A person is trying to steal my food, I need to fight back, right? Very basic emergencies, not complicated. So our body is designed to respond to emergencies, but once again, it's designed to respond to very basic emergencies, okay? Now, the way the human brain was designed is you have hardwired emergency responses built into your brain. You have 3 of them, which means even if you've never trained or thought, what would I do if this happens? If you're faced with an emergency situation, even an untrained person, completely untrained, their brain will automatically send them one of 3 hardwired responses. These are built in, right? Fight, flight, and freeze are the 3 hardwired emergency responses that are built into every single human being's brain, okay? Now, the reason those are hardwired is because they were useful in many, and they're useful in many prehistoric emergencies, right? Predators often track their prey by movement. So freeze is a built-in emergency response in many animals because that's how predators track prey. If you see how a deer reacts, oftentimes they'll freeze, right? Because they're trying to blend into their surroundings, and many of their predators track prey by movement. Fight obviously can be a useful response for some emergencies. If I'm faced with a situation where my life is in danger, I may want to fight back. I also may want to get away, right? So flight can be a useful response. Now, the problem is those are very basic responses and they don't take into account any complexity whatsoever. And it's all based really on how your brain works. So the area of human beings' brain that solves problems, comes up with new ideas, learns new things is the frontal lobe of your brain. So when let's say you were learning a musical instrument or you're learning how to drive or anything like that, you're using a lot of that frontal lobe of your brain, okay? And the less you know about a situation, the more you have to learn, the more frontal lobe of your brain you're using. As you start to get better and better at a particular thing, driving, music, whatever it is, you start to use less and less of the frontal lobe of your brain and you use more of the areas of your brain that contain kind of muscle memory or trained tasks, right? So think about driving a car. When you first started driving a car, you're using a lot of the frontal lobe of your brain because you've never done it before, right? You gotta remember all these things, turn signals on, check your mirrors, whatever it is, right? But now, most of you can probably drive a car. You probably have done this where you've driven from your work to your house and you didn't even really think about the actual drive, right? That's because for you, driving is not a frontal lobe. You're not using that problem-solving area of your brain anymore. You're using the trained muscle memory areas of your brain. Musical instruments, same thing. If you ever anybody in here play a musical instrument? I don't play anything. But if you play guitar or anything like that, if you ever watch somebody play guitar, it doesn't look like they're consciously thinking about what they're doing, and they're usually not if they're good because their brain, it's just kind of happening, right? Now, that's actually the reason that people that work in emergency response for a living basically train on emergency response all the time. And the reason is because when that area of your brain, when your problem-solving area of your brain becomes inaccessible, you need to essentially automatically respond. So we've got, at SEC, we've got a variety of different types of security people that work for us. We've got a couple former Navy SEALs, some Green Berets, and Navy SEALs especially, all they do is train. When they're not actually operating in combat, they're just training. And they're literally going over things over and over and over again so that when they are faced with the real emergency, their responses are just automatic. Like there's no thought put into it because they've done it so many times that it just becomes automatic. I mean, look at golf, look at any sports person, you know. Think about how many times a batter, a Major League Baseball player, has swung a bat, right? And they still, before every at-bat, get in that circle and do it again and again, right? And the reason is because it's all muscle memory. They're trying to get back to the point, or they're trying to get to the point where it just becomes automatic. Now, that's what we're really trying to do when we train people on emergency response. We're trying to put you in a position where you can actually automatically respond. Now, the reality is, if you don't respond to emergencies on a daily basis, you will probably never get there, right? In other words, if emergency response is not your primary world, then you probably won't ever get to the point where it's just muscle memory. But there are some things you can do to kind of trick your brain to better prepare should an emergency happen. So and we're going to talk about those here in just a second, but I want to talk about the body next. So just like your brain is designed to respond, your body's also designed to respond. So a couple things happen when your heart rate starts to go up during an emergency. Your body starts to take some actions that are designed to actually help you respond. One of the first things it does is it starts to redirect the blood out of your extremities into your core and into your large muscle groups. It's called vasoconstriction, okay? So it's actually literally squeezing the blood out of your extremities into your core, into your large muscle groups, so you can perform gross motor movements more effectively. So you'll be able to lift, push, pull, all those types of things better in an emergency. When you get better at gross motor skills, what happens to your body is the fine motor skills get diminished, right? So in an emergency, you'll find that your fine motor skills don't work as well. You'll also have what's called auditory exclusion, which is you won't hear everything as well. So you'll find that in emergency situations or when you get under stress, your brain won't process audible noises as well. It will often filter things out. You've actually all experienced this before in your car. You ever been driving in your car before and you had your radio turned up and you got stressed? What's the first thing every human being on the planet does? Turns the radio down. And the reason is because human beings are not good at effectively dealing with more than one stimulus at a time. And especially as we start to get stressed, our ability to even deal with more than one stimulus becomes almost impossible. So under stress, we are really good at focusing on one particular stimulus. When a second stimulus enters, our brains tend to shut down. Also can happen with your vision. We call it tunnel vision, which is basically just your brain saying, hey, I want you to be able to focus on what's most dangerous to you, and I'm going to cut out anything that I don't think is important. Training is the only thing that combats these effects, but it's also not important just if you train, but how you train. One of the things that we see a lot in emergency response is what we call training scars. So a training scar is created when you practice something incorrectly. You will tend to perform it incorrectly in the real event. In other words, if you practice swinging a golf club incorrectly, you probably are going to swing it incorrectly when you actually play golf, right? So it's the same thing with emergency response. If you practice something incorrectly, you will tend to respond incorrectly in the real event. So you want to try to avoid creating training scars. All right, we got a little bit more time here, so I get to go through this. Have any of you ever heard of this concept called the OODA loop? This is one of my favorite things. I didn't get a chance to go through it last time because we were a little bit slow, or a little bit behind. So the OODA loop is basically, when we talked about that stimulus, the OODA loop is basically how the human brain processes stimulus, okay? So your brain goes through this, what we call OODA loop, thousands of times a day. Anytime your brain is processing stimulus, it's going through this loop. Now, your brain can do this really well, one stimulus at a time, right? But the second a second stimulus gets entered into the equation, it causes what we call an OODA loop interruption. So let's use an example. We're going to use a traffic light, right? And the OODA loop basically is observe, orient, decide, act. And literally your brain goes through this in milliseconds multiple times a day. When you reach out to turn a doorknob, your brain is going through the OODA loop, right? So I'll explain what each step is. But it's observe, orient, decide, act. Observe is obviously pretty obvious, right? You have to observe whatever that stimulus is, right? Orient is, what is my experience and training tell me about how to respond to this stimulus? What have I experienced in the past? What do I know about this, right? Then based on that observation and that orientation, I make a decision, and then I act on that decision. So let's use a traffic light, right? So I'm driving down the street, and I observe a traffic light change from green to yellow, okay? I observe this. I move to orient, which is, what is my training experience about, what does this tell me about this particular stimulus? So what does it tell me about, what does it mean when a traffic light changes from green to yellow? You got to get through that light, people. That's what, no. What it means actually is, depending on your level of experience, your orientation to that is far different. If you've been driving for 30 years in Michigan, your orientation is different than a person that lived in Florida and is in their first winter in Michigan. because their experience is different, right? Their training, their experience with that particular stimulus. If you lived in Michigan, your orientation would say, hey, you know what? It'll depend on the road conditions. How close is the car behind me? Do I see any police officers, right? And then based on that orientation, you make a decision, gas or brake, and then you act on that decision, right? And your orientation adjusts over time. In other words, my daughter who's going through driver's training, her orientation when she sees a yellow light is going to be far different than yours because you've driven far more than she has. She hasn't experienced as much. So she may stop too hard and the car behind her might run into her, or she may not stop at all because she thinks she's closer to the light than she is. So your orientation to things adapts over time. And training, that's really what training is, right? It's adjusting your orientation to whatever that particular stimulus might be. Then based on that training, that experience, you make a decision, then you act, right? If at any point during that loop a second stimulus enters in, it causes one of two things to happen. It either causes you to have to go back to the beginning and observe that second stimulus, and now you're trying to observe two stimulus at the same time, right? You're trying to orient yourself to two stimulus at the same time. You're trying to make a decision on multiple stimulus at the same time, and you're trying to act on multiple stimulus, and human beings are not very good at that. And under stress, we are even less good at it. So imagine it was a ball, right? If I had a ball, I could throw a ball to you, and 100 times over, if I threw one ball, you'd catch it 100 out of 100 times, right? But if I threw two balls at you at the same time, your brain would say, yeah, we're not really equipped for that, right? And if you hadn't practiced for it, you probably wouldn't be very good at it. Your brain would say, I got to make a decision. One's high, one's low, right? And then it would try to act, but the quality of that action would be diminished by the fact that multiple stimulus had entered into your brain at the same time. Now, the reason this is important, actually, when it comes to active shooters, is if you think about what you're facing in an active shooter situation, you're going through this loop, but so is the attacker. Now, traditionally, what has happened is we have allowed the attacker to kind of move through this loop without any impediments at all. In other words, we've essentially allowed them to just observe targets, orient themselves, decide they're going to pull the trigger. We haven't inserted any additional stimulus to interrupt their loop. So the idea that what you want to try to do in an active shooter situation is cause what are called OODA loop interruptions. And we do that by inserting multiple stimulus into their loop at the same time, right? So that might be throwing things, running, getting behind, locking doors, whatever it is, to introduce multiple, interruptions into their loop at the same time. So they can't just move quickly through this loop. We're creating interruptions that are diminishing the quality of their action, right? It's making them less effective when they're trying to hurt people. And a lot of this has to do with the relationship between action and reaction, okay? How many of you believe in the crowd here, how many of you believe action is faster than reaction? Raise your hand. Okay, so for the people online, 0, 1 person raised his hand right at the very end. Okay, so I'll give one person thinks action is faster than reaction, which means the rest of you think reaction is faster than action. All right, we're going to perform a quick, I'll do it this way because you can't necessarily see me. Hold your hands a foot apart, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to smack my hands together, okay? And when I smack my hands together, I want you to beat me, okay? Some of you never moved your hands the whole time. All right. All right. Now, if you didn't cheat, did you ever beat me? Think about where act is. Think about what happened in your brain. Literally, you just went through the OODA loop during that experiment, right? You had to observe me moving my hands, right? Your brain said, he just told us, move our hands when he moves his hands. That's the training part, right? Your brain said, start moving your hands, and you started moving your hands. But the problem is, I was already here, and while you're still back there, right? So action is faster than reaction. Generally, action is faster than reaction. Now, why is this important for active shooter situations, or truthfully any emergency? But especially any emergency where somebody's trying to victimize you, is because generally The reason active shooter situations have been so damaging is because we have allowed the attacker to be in the action position. In other words, they've been taking action on us, and we've been reacting to what they're doing. What we want to try to do is actually flip the scenario and put them in the reaction position and put us in the action position so they're being forced to react to what we're doing. And the way we do that is by creating OODA loop interruptions, right? Running, throwing things, all the different things you can do to increase multiple stimulus into a person's brain reduces their ability to act effectively, right? So that's really what we're trying to teach people is you want to create as many interruptions in this person's loop as possible. If you think about an active shooter situation, if I was the bad guy, if one of you threw a water bottle at me, okay, that's a little bit of an interruption, but I could get past that pretty quick and get back to action, right? But if all of you were throwing things at me at the same time, how effective am I going to be in acting, right? How effective am I going to be in getting to that final step where I'm pulling the trigger? So that's what we're trying to teach people is you got to try to interrupt that loop. Does that make sense? All right. So there's really 3 stages of critical incident response: sensing danger, evaluating response options, and committing to some type of action, right? So the reality is every human being basically goes through these 3 stages when they're responding to any emergency at all, okay? You first have to know the emergency is happening. You have to sense the danger. Now, we sense danger the same way we sense anything else. We see it, right? Oh, there's a person shooting. We hear it. Oh, pop, pop. Oh, that's gunfire, right? We might even smell it, right? Oh, that smells like smoke. Maybe there's a fire, okay? Or, in the case of emergencies, other people tell us that it's happening. We call that an alert. In other words, if we didn't have tornado sirens, the only way you would sense a tornado was when it was tearing your house down, right? But we created these alerts to say, hey, I know you don't see this tornado yet, but I'm warning you that this is possibly there so that you can start to take action before you're actually experiencing the danger. A fire alarm does the same thing. Look just in this room. There's 1, 2, I think there might even be one on that wall. There's 2 fire pull stations in this one room. Now, theoretically, if there was a fire at the other end of the building, somebody could pull the pull station in that end of the building, and we would know immediately that there was a fire before we even started experiencing the fire, right? That's the idea behind what a fire alarm does. The same thing with a tornado siren, same thing with any other alert, right? What it is saying, hey, I know you're not experiencing this yet, but I want to give you a head start so that you can start taking action before it's impacting you. The reality is most people, even when they sense danger, don't always believe that what they're being told is real or that it will impact them. The fire alarm is actually a good example of that. Have you ever been in an environment, room, or wherever where a fire alarm went off and nobody did anything? Do you know why that happens? Because how many times have you heard a fire alarm before and it wasn't real? All the time, right? In fact, most of the fire alarms you have heard have been false alarms. Therefore, your brain says, okay, I bet you this next one is a false alarm too. That's why car alarms don't work anymore. Think about it. I remember when car alarms were new. 1990, if a car alarm went off, you would call the police, and they would actually send somebody. What do you do if a car alarm goes off now? You do nothing. You know why? Because you've been lied to so many times. You just have totally disregarded. You've been desensitized to that alert, and it means nothing to you anymore. So that sensing danger actually either we don't respond to it because there's so many false alarms, or we don't believe that it could impact us. That actually is the most important piece of responding to emergencies, because if you think about it logically, you cannot begin responding to an emergency before you know that emergency is happening. So sensing danger, there's some barriers. One is just denial. Because we don't experience danger on a daily basis, our brain tends to deny even the times when it is experiencing it because it just isn't normal, right? People that experience danger on a daily basis tend to move past that denial much faster because I have seen this before and, I do believe that it's real. But if I've never been shot at before, my brain has no frame of reference for that. So it says, well, this probably isn't real. Normalcy bias is that kind of tendency to give it a different explanation, right? Normally, that fire alarm isn't real, therefore this time it probably isn't real. Normally, when I hear that pop, pop, it's fireworks or it's something else, therefore this time it's probably fireworks, right? Social proof is basically we look at other people and we see what they're doing, and we do the same thing. So, especially when we're in a group, people will tend to respond based on what other people in the group they're in do. That's the case in almost every emergency, and it happens in both directions. In other words, sometimes people will panic and run when there is no emergency, and other times people will stay in environments where there is an emergency because other people in the environment stayed. Underestimating severity is just not believing that it will impact me. This is essentially human beings. Human beings believe emergencies happen. We all know. Bad things happen, right? We just don't necessarily believe they will happen to us. That's just a normal human behavior. We do believe active shooter situations will happen. We know one will happen this week, and it will. We just don't think it's going to happen to us. And you're probably right. And truthfully, the fact that you're probably right feeds actually into the other problems. When you do have one, your brain is going to say, well, it probably isn't real. Sensing danger is the most important piece. If you don't do that, nothing else matters, truthfully. So thinking about how you can spread information in an emergency is super important. The next step is, okay, now that I know the bad thing is happening, what am I going to do about this? This is basically situational awareness, okay? What is possible? What is the emergency that I'm facing? What can I do to respond to this emergency? What have I planned to do to respond to this emergency, right? So how am I going to deal with this, okay? This should be something that happens before the emergency, not during it. Because of the way your brain works, you're not likely to come up with new information during an emergency. So evaluating your response options is something that should happen via training, obviously like we're doing now, but most often it happens via this process we call mental scripting, which is literally putting yourself in a situation and saying, what would I do if this happened? Maybe you've done this before. Maybe you've been at work or walking to your car at the mall or whatever and said, hey, what would I do if somebody popped out of that bush, right? That's mental scripting. It's literally putting yourself in a situation and then kind of walking through what your response would be. That's how most training happens for people that don't respond to emergencies for a living. It's literally, you essentially have to force it on yourself to say, okay, think through what I would do if this particular situation happened, right? The reality is, you don't have to do it all the time. Your brain will pull up information. If you've thought about it in the past, your brain will be able to go back, and it has that stuff cataloged. If you mentally script it, it will be able to pull out and say, hey, yeah, we have thought about this, or we have practiced for this, and this is what we said we would do. But knowing your environment, being situationally aware based on the environment that you're in, can dramatically improve the effectiveness of your response. In other words, if you knew things like where your exit's at, right? What do I have available to me that might provide me with some protection, right? How do I communicate? Where's my cell phone? And the reality is, if you knew an emergency was coming, you probably would take some steps to prepare, right? If you were staying in this hotel and when you checked in, I said, hey, can't tell you what time, but at some point tonight there's going to be a real fire in this hotel and it's going to burn the building to the ground, right? But you can't check out. You got to go up to your room. I guarantee every person in here would probably arrange their belongings differently. You'd probably look at that little fire evacuation thing on the back of the door. You might even walk the route, right, to make sure you knew how to get out of the building. Problem is, that's not how emergencies work. So, and you roll the dice, most people do, including me, including every human being. You roll the dice on a daily basis with stuff, and you're like, it probably won't happen today. And good news is, it usually doesn't. Bad news is, it might happen eventually. And if you make it a habit of being situationally aware, you're more likely to be situationally aware when an emergency happens. The last step in that process is taking some action. The bottom line, truthfully, is in emergencies, you have to do something. Doing nothing, the worst decision you can make in an emergency is no decision at all. You have to do something. Literally, I've reviewed multiple incidents. And several incidents literally boiled down to, were the people at least moving? Like literally. In one particular incident that I reviewed, when there were a number of victims, every victim that was moving was an injury. Every victim that was standing still was a fatality, 100%. Like without exception. Every individual that was running or moving or doing something lived. Every person that wasn't moving didn't live. Literally doing something made a difference. So taking some type of action. Now, in an active shooter situation, your action is going to generally fall into these three categories. You're either going to get out, you're going to stay where you're at, or you're going to defend yourself or fight back, right? Now, we use this kind of run, hide, fight. You may have heard run, hide, fight before, right? Run, hide, fight is kind of the new stop, drop, and roll. Everybody in here has heard stop, drop, and roll, right? The difference between run, hide, fight, and stop, drop, and roll is stop, drop, and roll, first of all, is for when you're on fire. It will not work in this situation. It probably will make things significantly worse, if I'm being honest. So stop, drop, and roll, bad idea in an active shooter situation. And stop, drop, and roll is sequential. In other words, in order for it to work in a fire, it's not just throw them in any order you want, right? You have to do them in the correct order. Active shooter situations are not the same. In other words, run, hide, fight does not mean you have to go in order. You have to choose the one that is best given your particular set of circumstances. So depending on what you're faced with, you may go directly to fight. If I was the bad guy and I was sitting in this chair, you probably would have to go directly to confront, right? You wouldn't be able to start with run or hide. But over on this table over here, you could get out that door, right? But if I just change my position in the room and now I'm standing over there instead of here, now you could run and you might have to fight, right? So it's not about saying, oh, I'm going to try to get out, I'm going to try to get away. And that's unfortunately a lot of people that teach this teach that prioritization. Oh, you should try to run at all costs, try to get out. That's not at all what it means. What it means is, what is my best solution given the particular set of circumstances I'm in? Which might mean, who am I with, right? Am I by myself or am I with my family? Do I have young kids where this might not be as simple, right? Am I responsible for other people or is it just me? So running obviously is getting away. DHS uses hide. I don't like the connotations of hide because to me, I don't want you to just hide. I want you to seek some protection. If you're going to stay where you're at, you need to find some way to protect yourself, okay? So I use secure, and then confront or fight, defend yourself, whatever it is. Okay, escape or run, that's pretty obvious, right? Get out. If you have the ability to get out of the area, using the information you have, which might be, I don't know where the shooter is. So I don't want to run into a worse situation than what I'm in now, right? So that's the one reason that I talk to people about. Running could be a useful response, and oftentimes it is. But it doesn't mean you should just do it at all costs, right? You need to use some type of what am I hearing? What am I seeing? What do I know about what is happening? I may be better off staying where I'm at and trying to find some protection than I am running out a door into an unknown, right? If I just heard pop, 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 and I couldn't tell where the shooting was from, I don't know that I necessarily would want to run out into that area, but I don't know that I'd necessarily want to run out there either, because what if they're out there, right? I might want to gather more information. Okay, wait. Okay, now I can definitely hear it's coming from there. Or I hear screams coming from this side, and I'm looking out there and everybody doesn't know what's going on. Okay, that makes sense, right? Or I see people running all over the place in the parking lot, but I look over there and I don't see anybody. Okay, maybe so I'm going to use what I'm seeing. If I'm going to run, I want to make sure that I'm not running into something worse. If I'm going to secure, which means stay where I'm at or try to find some protection, I want to look for either cover or concealment, okay? Cover is something that will stop a bullet. A car is cover, okay? Not perfect cover, but it's cover, okay? Concealment could be that drapes on these tables, right? Now, if I hide under this table, can somebody shoot through that? Absolutely. But it's harder to shoot what you can't see. So if I didn't have any other options, then maybe that would be a possibility. So I want to look for cover or concealment. I want to find places that I can get secure, right? So even understanding, okay, where in my environment could I go and find a locked door? Are there any doors that lock? Are there any doors that swing in? Are the doors glass? Because then probably doesn't matter which way they swing because they're not going to be great. Try to figure out a way to provide some protection, okay? And then confront as you're fighting back. Usually confront is not something you want to seek. Confront is something that you're forced into. In other words, I tried to run, but I ran into the person. Or I tried to hide, and they came into my environment. The other issue that I see when I train this or when I run scenarios is that not only is it important to pick which one is best given your set of circumstances, but it's also important to understand that that decision may need to change based on a change in the set of circumstances. And actually what I find is people don't do that. In other words, if they choose to hide, they just stay hidden even when the person finds them. And they don't say, okay, well, hiding didn't work. I might want to switch to something that might be more successful, right? So it's not only about choosing the one that you think is best now, it's also about understanding that that may change a second later, and that may no longer be the best solution to the situation you're faced with, right? So it's not about picking your favorite, it's about picking the best one for your particular set of circumstances. Obviously, if you're going to confront, you want to think about what you can improvise as a weapon. So, there's a lot of things in car dealerships that can be pretty good weapons. And remember that the attacker is likely having those same physiological responses. So they're having that same auditory exclusion. They're likely having tunnel vision, which is why moving, truthfully, is important. If I'm getting shot at, the more distance I can put between myself and the gunman, and the more I can move, the less likely I am to be hit. It's way easier to hit a moving target or a stationary target than it is to hit a moving target. So remember that. Fight like your life depends on it, because it does. I think TV has really spoiled people's impressions of what it's like to be involved in a situation like this. The reality is the vast majority of gunshot wounds are not fatal. The vast majority. And the vast majority of shots that human beings take from weapons, they miss. And more vast majority of shots that people take when a target is moving, they miss. More than 7 out of 10 times, even a highly trained police officer will miss the target. So just because somebody has a gun doesn't mean you just give up and say, okay, well, I'm done for, right? There's still a lot of things you can do. So, and that's really what we call a survival mindset. Some people have a survival mindset, some people don't. I mean, there are literally plenty of examples of people that had what were probably minor wounds and died because they didn't have a survival mindset. And then there's people that have been shot 20 times and they should have been dead 19 of those and they're still alive today because their mindset was different, right? And in these trainings we talk a lot about that, especially when we run scenarios, that you really have to, your body can't go where your mind hasn't been. So really that mental scripting piece of really thinking through what would I do in this situation, right? Because your body's not going to be able to go there if you haven't gone there mentally yet, right? And you don't want to count on just getting lucky in an emergency. There's plenty of people that do, but I don't think that would be a strategy that I would want to deploy, the hopefully I get lucky strategy. So, all right, so a couple minutes left here. I'm going to turn it back over to Mark. He can talk a little bit about your workplace violence policy. If there's any questions, we'll answer those. But obviously, appreciate the time. This was designed to be an introduction training, right? So we only had an hour, so we're trying to give you as much as we can in an hour. So I appreciate everybody's attention.
Okay, first off, any questions from the group or any coming in online? I didn't see any when I was on there in a minute. Question?
You see the news of people confronting shoplifters and things like that, and the companies are against employees confronting people.
Yeah.
Is that something that we need to talk about?
Well, it's a good question. We certainly don't want to, we have to protect our company assets. There's no question. And most of the things, I think the vast majority of things that we can do to protect our assets are on the proactive side. That means making sure our building's locked, making sure our keys are stored securely at night. I mean, believe it or not, that is a huge thing. But we should not be, to the extent possible, the only time you should be physically engaging with someone is if your life or your, something is in jeopardy, a physical, the life of yourself or the person of somebody else at our store. You shouldn't be tackling someone to say, let them take the car, yeah. And I'll leave it there. Yeah, call the police, get out of there. If you can grab a key and run out with you, that's fine. But we don't want anyone wrestling with somebody. We've had this, believe it or not. We've had it in Grand Rapids. We've had someone who's wrestling with someone, and it's not good. It's not good. And remember, a property crime, you learned this in law school right out of the gates, but a property crime is not worth risking your life, somebody else's life, even if that person's not armed and you get engaged in some sort of wrestling match with someone. Most of us, listen, I like to think I'm in good shape and I play basketball once a week and all that sort of thing. Listen, I may go into cardiac arrest if I spend 5 minutes wrestling with somebody on the ground and that sort of thing, and that's not worth it. We want to let them, I hate to say it, but let's not risk our lives, our health, or anything like that. We have insurance for cars that get stolen, and we will get our money back, but it's more about being proactive and making things as hard as you can, kind of making ourselves hard targets, so to speak, for theft. That's a great question, though. It's a great question. Anything else? Okay, 2 closing points. 1, Jason talked a little bit about being situationally aware, and he talked about it in the last section too, and session. And when you think about it, you think, oh, geez, I don't have the time to go around and analyzing every little step and every little place that I go. Really, when you think about it, we're talking about seconds. Seconds. When you go into the movie theater, look around. Oh, there's an exit. It's like that. Just being aware and taking a second to look around and see where exits are, or where do you want to sit. That sort of thing. So we're not talking about devote every time, you got to do, like when you go to see a movie, it's not like the Secret Service with the president where they come in a day in advance and scout the scene. You don't need to do that for all these sort of things. You go to Denny's with your family, you don't need to go in an hour before and get a floor plan and all this sort of thing. It's just taking a minute, taking a second and looking around, because nothing's going to happen anyways, but in the off chance something strange happens, you've taken that 1 second. The line is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's really what applies here. Secondly, and my final closing remark is, listen, everyone here at the store, you're the eyes and ears of the company, and when Jason talked about early on some of those warning signs that people may exhibit or things that you may see that could be indicators of God forbid, of act of violence to come, please don't sit on that information. If you've seen something in a customer, in a coworker, in the significant other of a customer or a coworker, or something that's giving you that gut feeling, that just uneasy feeling, let somebody know. And so how do you do that? Well, of course, you can talk to your direct manager. You can talk to the general manager. Each location has an on-site HR representative that you can talk to. Hopefully you know who that person is. You can call Sherry Menard, our vice president of HR. You can call me. Wherever, all doors are open for this sort of thing. But if there's a situation where you just don't feel comfortable attaching your name to that concern, we also have an anonymous hotline. It's called our Ethics Point. It's not really a hotline, it's an email platform, and you can go, it's on the DP Fox Buzz page. Let me say that again, the DP Fox Buzz page, and it's within the HR section, and it's basically called the Ethics Point portal. And you can go in there and submit an anonymous concern to alert folks in the corporate office about any concerns that you might have. So it's a good resource for everyone here. So thank you very much to those who made the trip over here in this hectic Detroit traffic. Grand Rapids, we're not used to this sort of traffic over here. So, we appreciate that. And to everyone who was streaming in live, thank you very much. That's a wrap. We're out.